Hey everyone, welcome back to HOA Havoc. I'm your host bringing you another unbelievable story that you literally cannot make up. Today's story comes from Jake, a 28-year-old software engineer from Colorado. And let me tell you, this one is absolutely wild. Make sure to hit that subscribe button because stories like this are exactly why this channel exists. You're going to want to grab some popcorn for this one because the revenge is absolutely sweet. So let's dive right into Jake's story. Picture this. Jake grew up in a beautiful small mountain town in Colorado called Pine Ridge Valley. His grandfather, Harold, owned about 15 acres of pristine land right at the edge of town, complete with a cozy cabin that had been in their family for over 60 years. Jake spent every summer there as a kid, fishing in the creek, hiking the trails, and learning woodworking from his grandfather. It was literally his childhood paradise, and he always assumed it would stay in the family forever. But life has a funny way of throwing curveballs. When Jake turned 18, he got a full scholarship to MIT for computer science. His grandfather Harold was incredibly proud and encouraged him to chase his dreams in the tech world. Jake moved to Silicon Valley after graduation and landed an amazing job at a major tech company. He was making 6 figures, living the dream, but he was also working insane hours and barely had time to visit home. Years flew by in a blur of coding, meetings, and city life. Then tragedy struck. Jake's grandfather, Harold, passed away suddenly from a heart attack when Jake was 26. Jake was absolutely devastated. Harold had been more than just a grandfather. He was Jake's mentor, best friend, and the person who taught him everything about integrity and standing up for what's right. The funeral was heartbreaking, and Jake felt guilty that he hadn't visited more often in recent years. Here's where things get interesting, though. Harold's will was very specific. He left the entire property to Jake, but with one condition. Jake couldn't sell it or develop it for at least 5 years. Harold wanted to make sure the land stayed in the family and wasn't turned into some commercial development. Jake respected his grandfather's wishes, even though he was living across the country and had no immediate plans to move back. Jake arranged for a local property management company to keep an eye on things. He paid them to maintain the cabin, keep the grounds clean, and basically preserve everything exactly as Harold had left it. Jake figured he'd eventually move back when he was ready to settle down. Maybe start a family. The property taxes were manageable, and Jake's tech salary made the maintenance costs pretty negligible. Now here's where our story really begins. About 18 months after Harold passed away, Jake started getting weird phone calls from someone named Margaret Whitfield. Margaret introduced herself as the president of something called the Pine Ridge Valley Homeowners Association. Jake was immediately confused, because his grandfather's property had never been part of any HOA. Harold had specifically chosen that land decades ago precisely because it was outside any community restrictions. Margaret was incredibly pushy from the very first call. She claimed that the town had grown and that Jake's property was now technically within the boundaries of their newly expanded HOA district. She demanded that Jake pay retroactive HOA fees totaling over $8,000, plus monthly dues going forward. Jake politely explained that his property had never been part of any HOA, and that he had documentation proving it was exempt from any such agreements. Margaret became increasingly hostile with each phone call. She started sending certified letters demanding payment and threatening legal action. She claimed Jake's property was an eyesore, and that the cabin violated multiple HOA aesthetic standards. This was absolutely ridiculous, because Jake's property management company was maintaining everything beautifully. The cabin was rustic but well-maintained. The grounds were pristine, and everything was exactly as it had been when Harold was alive. Jake tried to handle this diplomatically at first. He had his lawyer send Margaret copies of all the relevant property documents proving that his land had never been subject to HOA restrictions. He showed historical surveys, original deeds, and every piece of documentation that clearly established his property's independence. Any reasonable person would have backed down at this point, but Margaret was not reasonable. Instead of apologizing, Margaret doubled down. She started claiming that Jake was somehow trying to cheat the system and avoid his community responsibilities. She began organizing other HOA members to harass Jake's property management company. She filed complaints with the county claiming Jake was operating an illegal campground because his property had RV hookups that Harold had installed for family visits. She even tried to get the fire department to condemn the cabin by claiming it was a fire hazard. Jake was getting increasingly frustrated, but he was also busy with a major product launch at work. He was pulling 12-hour days and honestly didn't have the mental bandwidth to deal with this crazy woman's harassment. He figured his lawyer could handle it, and eventually Margaret would realize she had no legal standing whatsoever. but Margaret was just getting started. She somehow got Jake's personal cell phone number and started calling him at all hours. She would call during his work meetings, at midnight, on weekends, always with some new demand or threat. She started telling other people in town that Jake was some kind of absentee landlord who didn't care about the community. She spread rumors that he was planning to turn his grandfather's property into a commercial development or a party venue. The harassment escalated to an insane level. Margaret organized her HOA cronies to start patrolling Jake's property line with measuring tapes, claiming his fence was 6 inches over the property boundary. She filed noise complaints claiming Jake's property manager was running loud equipment, even though the guy was just using a normal lawnmower once a week. She tried to get the postal service to stop delivering mail to Jake's property, claiming the mailbox violated HOA standards. Jake's property manager, an older gentleman named Bob, was getting so harassed that he actually considered quitting. Bob told Jake that Margaret and her HOA friends were showing up multiple times per week, taking photos, measuring things, and basically treating his property like they owned it. Margaret had even tried to enter the cabin itself, claiming she needed to inspect it for code violations. This went on for over a year. Jake's lawyer kept sending cease and desist letters, but Margaret ignored them completely. She seemed to think that because Jake lived far away, she could just bully him into submission. She started telling people in town that she was going to force Jake to sell the property so it could be developed properly according to HOA standards. But then Jake's life took an unexpected turn. The tech company he worked for was acquired by a larger corporation, and Jake's position was eliminated in the restructuring. Instead of being devastated, Jake saw this as an opportunity. He had saved up a substantial amount of money, and he was honestly burned out from the Silicon Valley lifestyle. He started thinking more and more about his grandfather's property and wondering if maybe it was time to come home. Jake made a decision that would change everything. He decided to move back to Colorado and start a remote consulting business from his grandfather's cabin. He could live simply, enjoy the mountain lifestyle he'd grown up loving, and still maintain his career in tech. It seemed like the perfect solution, and he was excited to finally put Margaret's harassment behind him by dealing with her face to face. Jake didn't tell anyone he was moving back. He wanted to surprise his old friends, and also wanted to see exactly what Margaret had been up to without her knowing he was watching. He arranged to have his belongings shipped, quit his apartment lease, and drove cross-country back to Pine Ridge Valley. When Jake arrived at his property, he was shocked by what he saw. Margaret had apparently been treating his land like her personal kingdom. There were HOA signs posted along his fence line claiming his property was subject to community standards. She had somehow installed a speed bump on the public road right in front of his driveway, making it difficult for vehicles to enter his property. Most infuriatingly, she had placed a large sign right at his property entrance that read, "Future site of Pine Ridge Valley Community Park, pending development approval." Jake was absolutely furious. This woman had been harassing him for over a year, and now she was actively trying to steal his land by spreading false information about its future use. Jake documented everything with photos and videos, then called his lawyer to discuss potential legal action for harassment, defamation, and trespassing. But Jake decided to have a little fun first. He wanted to see just how far Margaret would take her delusions of authority. Jake parked his car inside his cabin and stayed out of sight for a few days while he planned his approach. He watched from his windows as Margaret and her HOA cronies continued their regular patrols of his property line, taking photos and making notes like they were conducting official business. On his 4th day back, Jake decided it was time for the confrontation. He walked out to his front porch early in the morning and started doing some basic maintenance work, just to see how long it would take for Margaret to show up. He didn't have to wait long. Within 30 minutes, a silver SUV pulled up to his gate, and out stepped a woman who could only be Margaret Whitfield herself. Margaret was exactly what Jake had imagined. A perfectly coiffed blonde woman in her 50s, wearing expensive athletic wear and carrying a clipboard like it was a weapon of authority. She marched up to Jake's fence with the confidence of someone who truly believed she owned the world around her. Jake pretended not to notice her and continued his work. "Excuse me," Margaret shouted across the yard.
"You cannot be here!"
"This is private property under HOA jurisdiction, and you are trespassing." Jake looked up with fake surprise and walked over to the fence. "Oh, hi there," he said casually. "I'm just taking care of some maintenance issues. The property owner asked me to handle a few things." This was technically true since Jake was the property owner asking himself to handle things. Margaret's eyes lit up like she had caught a criminal in the act. "The property owner is in California and has been completely unresponsive to all HOA communications," she said with obvious satisfaction. "I am Margaret Whitfield, President of the Pine Ridge Valley HOA, and I am ordering you to leave immediately. This property is subject to a pending community acquisition due to unpaid fees and violations. Jake had to work hard not to laugh. Community acquisition? He asked innocently. What does that mean exactly? Margaret puffed up like a peacock. It means this property will be seized by the HOA and converted to community use because the owner has refused to comply with our standards and pay his obligations. I have been working with the county for over a year to resolve this situation. Jake nodded seriously. Wow, that sounds pretty official. How much does the owner owe exactly? Margaret consulted her clipboard importantly. The total amount including fees, fines, and penalties is now over $37,000. Plus, he'll need to pay for all the improvements required to bring the property up to HOA standards, which we estimate at another $40,000 minimum. Jake almost choked. This woman was completely delusional. That seems like a lot of money, he said. What happens if the owner just pays what he owes? Could he keep the property? Margaret looked annoyed by the question. The owner has had multiple opportunities to resolve this situation. At this point, the HOA board has decided that the best solution for the community is acquisition and redevelopment. We're going to turn this into a proper community space instead of letting it sit here as an eyesore. Jake decided to push a little further. Have you actually spoken to the property owner recently? Maybe he's changed his mind about cooperating. Margaret laughed dismissively. I've been calling and writing to him for over a year. He's clearly not interested in being a responsible community member. He hired some property management company to ignore us, and he thinks he can just hide in California forever. Well, he's about to learn that we don't give up here in Pine Ridge Valley. This was the moment Jake had been waiting for. That's really interesting, he said slowly, because I'm Jake Morrison, and this is my property. The change in Margaret's expression was absolutely priceless. Her face went through about 15 different emotions in the span of 3 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, anger, fear, and then back to anger but much more intense. That's impossible, she sputtered. Jake Morrison lives in California. You're obviously lying to try to get out of trouble for trespassing. Jake pulled out his driver's license and held it up to the fence. Nope, I'm definitely Jake Morrison, and I definitely own this property. I moved back to Colorado last week, and I have to say, I'm pretty impressed by all the creative ways you've been harassing me for the past year and a half. Margaret's face was turning bright red. You can't just show up here and think you can avoid your responsibilities. This property is still subject to HOA jurisdiction, and you still owe all those fees and penalties. Jake shook his head calmly. Actually, Margaret, this property has never been subject to HOA jurisdiction, as my lawyer has explained to you repeatedly. You've been harassing me based on completely false claims, and now you've been trespassing on my property and posting false signs about community acquisition. Margaret was starting to look genuinely panicked, but she was also doubling down on her aggression. I don't care what your lawyer says. This HOA has authority over all properties in this district, and we're not going to let you turn this place into some kind of party house or commercial development. Jake raised an eyebrow. Who said anything about a party house or commercial development? I'm just planning to live here quietly and work from home. You're lying! Margaret screamed. Nobody moves back to a small town just to live quietly. You're obviously planning something that will destroy our property values and ruin our community. At this point, Margaret was completely losing it. She was waving her arms around. Her voice was getting higher and shriekier, and she looked like she was about to have a complete breakdown. Jake decided it was time to drop the real bombshell. Margaret, I think you should know something important before you keep making threats. I actually looked into the Pine Ridge Valley HOA after all your calls and letters, and I discovered some very interesting information about your community. Margaret looked suspicious. What kind of information? Jake smiled. Well, it turns out that your entire HOA community is built on land that was originally part of a larger ranch that was subdivided in the 1970s. The original ranch owner retained mineral rights and certain development rights when he sold off the individual lots. Those rights were later sold to a development company, which went bankrupt in the 1990s. Margaret was looking increasingly uncomfortable, but she tried to maintain her authoritative demeanor. So what? That doesn't change anything about current HOA jurisdiction. Jake's smile got wider. Actually, it changes everything, because when the development company went bankrupt, all of their assets were sold at auction, including the mineral rights and development rights to your HOA community. The color was starting to drain from Margaret's face. What are you trying to say? Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out a folder of documents. I'm saying that I bought those rights at auction 6 months ago, which means I now own the mineral rights and development rights to every single property in your HOA community. including yours. Margaret's mouth fell open. That's impossible! You can't own rights to other people's properties. Jake nodded. Actually, I can. It's completely legal and happens all the time. The homeowners in your community own their houses and the surface rights to their lots. But I own the subsurface mineral rights and the air rights for any development above a certain height. I also have easement rights for accessing those mineral rights, which means I can potentially put roads or utilities across any property in your community if necessary. Margaret was starting to hyperventilate. You're lying! You're making this up to try to scare me. Jake handed her a copy of the deed and the legal survey. Feel free to have your lawyer verify everything. It's all completely legitimate and properly recorded with the county. While Margaret was frantically reading through the documents, Jake continued his explanation. Now, I want to make something very clear. I bought these rights purely as an investment and because I was curious about the legal situation after all your harassment. I have no current plans to exercise any of these rights. I'm perfectly happy to let everyone in your community continue living peacefully without any interference from me. Margaret looked up with a mixture of hope and suspicion. What's the catch? Jake's expression became very serious. The catch is that I expect the harassment to stop immediately. I expect you to remove all those false signs from my property. I expect you to stop filing false complaints and spreading lies about my plans. And I expect a written apology for 18 months of systematic harassment. Margaret's face was cycling through emotions again. And if I don't agree to your demands? Jake shrugged. Well, then I might decide to exercise some of my development rights. For example, I could potentially put a gravel mining operation right in the middle of your community. Or I could lease the mineral rights to a fracking company. Or I could develop some high-density, low-income housing that would completely change the character of your neighborhood. Margaret was looking absolutely horrified. You can't do that! It would destroy our property values. It would ruin everything we've worked to build. Jake nodded sympathetically. You're absolutely right. It would be terrible for everyone involved. That's why I'm hoping we can work out a more reasonable arrangement. What kind of arrangement? Margaret asked weakly. Jake smiled. It's actually pretty simple. You stop harassing me and interfering with my property, and I continue to have no interest in developing anything in your community. You remove your false signs and stop spreading lies about my plans, and I don't start looking into commercial development opportunities. You issue a written apology for your behavior, and I don't file harassment charges or pursue damages for defamation. Margaret was clearly struggling with the situation. Her entire worldview had been turned upside down in the span of 10 minutes. She had gone from thinking she was in complete control to realizing that her worst nightmare was now holding all the cards. How do I know you won't change your mind later and develop something anyway? She asked. Jake considered this. That's a fair question. How about this? I'll sign a legal agreement stating that as long as there are no further harassment issues from you or your HOA, I will not exercise my development rights without giving the community at least 2 years advance notice and an opportunity to purchase those rights from me at fair market value. Margaret looked slightly relieved, but she was still clearly struggling with the power dynamics. What if someone else in the HOA has an issue with your property? I can't control everyone. Jake nodded. I understand that. I'm only holding you responsible for your own actions and for any HOA actions that you initiate or support as president. If individual community members have legitimate concerns, they're welcome to discuss them with me directly like civilized adults. Margaret was quiet for several minutes, clearly trying to process everything. Finally, she looked up. I need to discuss this with the HOA board and my husband. Jake nodded. That's fine. Take your time. But I want those false signs removed from my property by tomorrow, and I want the harassment to stop immediately. We can work out the details of the written agreement over the next week or two. As Margaret walked back to her car, Jake could see that she was completely deflated. All of her bluster and authority had evaporated once she realized that her actions had consequences, and that she wasn't dealing with someone she could bully from a distance. Jake felt a mixture of satisfaction and sympathy. He was glad to finally put an end to the harassment, but he also felt bad about how thoroughly he had destroyed Margaret's sense of control and authority. Over the next few days, Jake watched as Margaret and her HOA cronies quietly removed all the false signs from his property. The speed bump mysteriously disappeared from the road in front of his driveway. The harassment phone calls stopped completely. Margaret even sent a brief email apologizing for the misunderstanding about his property's HOA status, though she stopped short of acknowledging the full extent of her bad behavior. Jake's story doesn't end there, though. About a month after the confrontation, Margaret showed up at his property again. But this time her attitude was completely different. She was nervous and deferential, asking if they could discuss the development rights situation in more detail. It turned out that several families in the HOA community were interested in purchasing the mineral rights from Jake to ensure their long-term security. Jake was open to the conversation. He had never intended to actually develop anything. He had only bought the rights because he was curious about the legal situation and wanted to have some leverage against Margaret's harassment. After several weeks of negotiations involving lawyers for both sides, Jake agreed to sell the mineral and development rights back to the HOA community for a price that gave him a modest profit while being fair to the homeowners. The sale was structured so that each homeowner bought back the rights to their specific property, eliminating any future concerns about outside development. Jake used part of the profits to make some improvements to his grandfather's cabin and to set up a proper home office for his consulting business. The rest he invested for his future. But here's the most interesting part of the whole story. About 6 months after everything was resolved, Jake ran into Margaret at the local grocery store. Instead of avoiding him or being hostile, she actually approached him and struck up a conversation. It turned out that the whole experience had been a major wake-up call for her about how she had been treating people and wielding authority in the community. Margaret admitted that she had gotten carried away with her role as HOA president and had started seeing challenges to her authority as personal attacks on her character. She acknowledged that she had been completely wrong about Jake's property status and had let her ego prevent her from backing down when she should have. Most surprisingly, she thanked Jake for handling the situation in a way that taught her a lesson without completely destroying her reputation in the community. Jake was impressed by Margaret's honesty and personal growth. They actually became friendly acquaintances, though Jake made it clear that any future HOA issues would need to be handled through proper legal channels rather than personal harassment campaigns. Margaret agreed and seemed to genuinely understand why her previous approach had been so problematic. The whole experience taught Jake some valuable lessons too. He realized that sometimes the best way to deal with bullies is not to avoid the confrontation, but to prepare thoroughly and then meet them head-on with superior knowledge and resources. He also learned that people are capable of change when they're forced to confront the consequences of their actions in a direct way. Jake still lives peacefully on his grandfather's property, running his consulting business and enjoying the mountain lifestyle he had missed during his years in Silicon Valley. He's become more involved in the local community, but on his own terms, rather than through forced participation in organizations that don't serve his interests. He's even started a small non-profit that helps other property owners deal with HOA harassment and boundary disputes. Margaret has apparently become a much more reasonable HOA president, focusing on actual community improvements rather than power trips and harassment campaigns. The Pine Ridge Valley HOA still exists, but it now operates more like a genuine community organization rather than Margaret's personal fiefdom. Several longtime residents have told Jake that the change in leadership style has made the whole community more pleasant and cooperative. Looking back on the whole experience, Jake says the most satisfying part wasn't the revenge or the financial profit from selling back the development rights. It was the moment when Margaret realized that her actions had consequences and that she couldn't just bully people indefinitely without eventually facing someone who was prepared to fight back effectively. Jake believes that more people need to stand up to HOA bullies and property harassment, but they need to do it strategically rather than just getting angry and making empty threats. The story has become something of a legend in Pine Ridge Valley, though most people don't know all the details about the development rights and the legal maneuvering. They just know that Margaret Whitfield tried to mess with the wrong property owner and learned a valuable lesson about respecting other people's rights and property boundaries. Jake's advice for anyone facing similar harassment is to document everything, consult with qualified attorneys, and remember that bullies usually back down when they realize their targets are prepared to fight back with superior resources and knowledge. He also emphasizes the importance of staying calm and professional even when dealing with completely unreasonable people, because losing your temper usually just gives bullies more ammunition to use against you. And that's the story of how Jake Morrison turned the tables on HOA, Karen Margaret Whitfield, and taught her that harassment has consequences. Sometimes the best revenge is simply being better prepared than your opponent and letting them defeat themselves through their own bad behavior. Thanks for watching HOA Havoc, and make sure to subscribe for more unbelievable stories about property disputes, neighborhood drama, and the sweet satisfaction of justice served cold.